For many American Negroes, the sit-in movement has become a rallying point in the struggle for full equality. And yet there is as well a significantly large number of American Negroes, the Muslims, who have objected strenuously to the sit-ins. In view of this, Mr. Malcolm, I would like to ask you, what is it precisely that the Muslims object to about the sit-in movement?
Yes, Mr. Donald, and first I would like to say that I'm speaking not for myself, but as a follower and helper and representative of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who is the spiritual head of the fastest growing group, religious group, of black people here in the Western Hemisphere. And when we give our views, we don't give them as a civic group, we don't give them as a political group, but we give them primarily as a religious group. And any solution that we set forth, we absolutely feel that it's a religious solution rather than a political solution. One of the reasons that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in teaching us here in America, is giving us a solution that differs drastically from the sit-in movement. He's trying to make us men. Now, the very fact that you find students all over the world today are standing up for their rights and fighting for their rights. But here in America, the so-called Negro students have allowed themselves to be maneuvered under a tag of sit-in. The word sit itself is not an honorable tag. Anybody can sit. An old woman can sit. A coward can sit. A baby can sit. Anything can sit. But it takes a man to stand. And when they attach this sit-in term or title to this movement, it stigmatizes it, in my opinion.
Is this the passivity of it that you object to?
Well, that actually, I guess it describes it. The name describes its nature. It's a passive thing, and also we feel that to try and sit down in another man's restaurant to drink a cup of coffee is insane. If I were in the South and a Southerner didn't want me to eat in his restaurant, and I forced my way in and then let him go back in his kitchen and prepare some coffee for me to drink, I'd consider myself insane to drink it. We don't think that that's the solution. We feel that rather than to force our way into someone else's restaurant or public place that they have established, that we should get our own. Once we have our own, we're respected for the fact that we can create our own. And that's equality right there. Thirdly, we feel that the sit-in movement actually represents a new Negro in the sense that it represents dissatisfaction. It shows that the new generation here in America of black students have lost the fear of the white man that our parents had. 20 years ago, the average so-called Negro, if he was dissatisfied with something, the degree of dissatisfaction that he would show would be tempered or controlled by his concern as to what the white man's attitude would be if he showed that he didn't like it. And the sit-in movement, the good part of the sit-in movement, in my opinion, represents the fact that there is a new generation of so-called Negroes who are dissatisfied. And the fact that they will go into these places shows that they differ from their parents in that they have lost fear of that obstacle that their parents feared. Now, I think that the white man realized when the sit-in movement first started that it was a dangerous thing. And in my opinion, the way he has captured it and controls it right to this day, he put the same leaders that formerly had kept the Negroes walking along a patient, passive road were jockeyed into a position where now they are the advisors to these students. In being accepted by the students as advisors, the student sit-in movement, in my opinion, has lost its militancy to the degree that it has accepted advice of these preachers and politicians who usually are for their own personal benefit rather than for the masses of black people on the whole. And I would like to say in conclusion on that point that if a man is going to have his tooth pulled, the pain that he receives from the extraction will make him manifest a violent reaction pain automatically makes a person resist or put up some form of action to defend himself from that which is causing him pain. But to keep a man, in order for the dentist to be able to handle the patient, he puts Novocaine in the patient's jaw, and though he's still extracting the tooth, this Novocaine makes the patient think that nothing is being done to him. And I think that the student sit-in movement shows that the black people here in America finally became so overburdened with pain that they were about to display some violent reaction to all of these injustices. And to keep this down, I think that the powers that be maneuvered these Negro preachers and other politicians into a position to advise these students, and it was just like injecting Novocaine into them. And their militancy today, again I say, is displayed according to the degree of advice they accept from the older leaders.
Would you agree that their goal is a worthwhile one?
If their goal is integration, it's not a worthwhile one. But if their goal is freedom, justice, and equality, then that's a worthwhile goal. If integration is going to give the black people in America complete freedom, complete justice, and complete equality, then it's a worthwhile goal. But if this word that they've invented, integration, and as I mentioned, the Novocaine that is put into the patient's jaw, in this sense, it would be integration. Just the holding this integration bottle and dangling it in front of the Negroes in America today has actually disabled them, or it has nullified their ability to stand up and fight like a man for something that is theirs by right, rather than to just sit around and beg and wait for the white man to make up his mind that they're worthy to have this type thing. I think that this is, in my opinion, why we disagree with the sit-in movement. If they are willing to wait for another 100 years for the white man to change his mind to accept them as a human being, then they're wrong. But if they're willing to lay down their life tonight or in the morning in order that we can have what is ours by right tonight or in the morning, then it's a good movement. But as long as they're willing to wait for the white man to make up his mind that they are qualified to be respected as human beings, then I'm afraid that all of their waiting and their planning is for naught. As Thurgood Marshall said on New Year's Eve, the Supreme Court brought about the desegregation decision, I think 6 or 7 years ago, and there is only 6% desegregation in America right now. We don't call two students, black students going to the University of Georgia, integration, nor do we call 4 children, black children going to school in New Orleans, integration, nor do we call a handful of black students going to school in Little Rock, integration. If every black man in the state of Arkansas can't go to any school he wants, that's not integration. And if every black child in the state of Louisiana cannot go to any school that they are qualified for in the morning, then that's not integration. And likewise with Georgia and any other state in America. It's no integration with us until the entire thing is laid on the table, not 100 years from now, but in the morning. And at the rate that the NAACP, CORE, and the Urban League is willing to accept the change of attitude in the white man's mind, we who are Muslims feel we'll be sitting around here in America for another 1,000 years, not waiting for civil rights or something like that, but even waiting to be granted the rights of a human being.
Mr. McCullings, do you feel that your movement has been emasculated the way that Mr. Malcolm described it?
Quite on the contrary, Mr. Donald. The first thing I'd like to point out is perhaps many people have been quite uninformed as to the start of the movement and the reasons for the movement. Many people seem to get the idea that this movement started as a result of somebody coming in and organizing and saying, this is a way that we can achieve full integration. So why don't you students get together and do thus and thus? The situation is quite on the contrary. The movement started in Greensboro, North Carolina, with a young man from Washington, D.C., who was a student at A&T College, who decided one day while downtown that he'd like to have a cup of coffee. And he decided that he'd go into a drugstore that had been as far as he could remember, and probably as far as any of his parents or grandparents could remember, was strictly taboo as far as the lunch counter was concerned. This particular young man decided that he would go in and sit down and order a cup of coffee, and he did. He was refused. Then and there he decided that something could and should be done about this particular thing. And one of the best ways to do this, he decided, was through a nonviolent, peaceful means. The weapons of violence are quite obvious. I think that any intelligent individual can realize this, that you can fight a weapon of violence. The weapons of nonviolence are not so obvious, and it becomes very difficult to cope with them. The reasons for requesting a cup of coffee were not because the individual desired a cup of coffee so much. For I'm sure that if he had gone back to the dormitory or gone back to the campus, he could have very easily got a cup of coffee without any trouble at all. After the movement began, it became quite obvious that the argument, the sit-in movement, the demonstrations were not for cups of coffee, but were for all the other facets of life that individuals have to come in contact with daily. I think that this too has been visualized in the wrong sense. 9 times out of 10, if the students in the southern schools were served coffee anytime they wanted to be served at these lunch counters, they would never bother about buying it. But I think that they visualized that there had to be a starting point. And this was just as good a starting point as any. With a demand for a cup of coffee at a lunch counter that was strictly taboo, from an individual who had always remained on top and subjected his fellow man, the Negro, to all sorts of discriminatory ideas and concepts. This immediately became a challenge to explore all the other facets of life: employment, education, and everything else that you want to name. This then is the reason for the sit-in, not to secure a cup of coffee, but to explore and secure all the equal opportunities available to all Americans in our democratic way of life.